knows now how long he'll rot in jail and prison. There hasn't been much news yet about the charges, and he might be awaiting trial. So that's still there. Young man whose life is now ruined by this. Nevertheless, it lets some information out that some of it looks pretty darn reliable and tells us a little bit more about how things work at the Pentagon and just how badly the U.S. mismanages a lot of its relationships with its own allies, how it's spying on its own allies, how it's shelling out foreign aid money to its allies who are then working with Russia and so on. And Zach will cover a lot of those details here. And so that's the basic rundown of that. So it's been about a month now since it was news, and there's still a lot more to know about what happens to Jack Teixeira. But this just leaves a lot of questions about why was he in a position to leak these documents, and what does this tell us about American foreign policy? So, Zach, I guess really we could just start off with some of the basics here. You've got a list here of what you think are some of the most salient issues. So why don't we just get right into it about what you think are some of the most important bits of information learned from these leaked documents, and we can kind of just go from there.
As you mentioned about U.S. allies, this to me is just sort of hilarious in like a dark way. Like most U.S. foreign policy is full of dark humor. So the U.S. since 1946 has given Egypt $85 billion. Nowadays it's about $1.3 billion a year. And these leaks, and these I've not seen these documents, but it's been reported by a whole bunch of other places. Because as you said, there was not just one leak. This guy was just putting them on Discord, and then they just disseminated all over the place. But the military dictator of Egypt, basically, it's the one thing these leaks seem to show is we just have intelligence agents everywhere, because we know so much about what's happening in internal administrations of all these countries. But basically, the military dictator of Egypt was trying to arrange to sell 40,000 rockets to Russia. And he's like, we have to do this carefully so the U.S. doesn't find out, we have to route them carefully. Well, apparently someone sitting in on the meeting is on the U.S. payroll, or we have moved tap or something, because we knew right away. So that's just absurd right off the bat. That, we've provided over $100 billion to Ukraine. And this other country we've given $85 million to over the years is actively working against us, even though we write them a big check every year. Although that check is mostly so they can then buy American military equipment. So really it's a convoluted rent-seeking scheme. But still, that's infuriating. Another thing is that the United Arab Emirates was going to open some sort of Russian military equipment repair facility. And I think this would be related to Russian equipment in Syria, where Russian and American planes have been like playing chicken recently. So it's just sort of like the UAE, we just sold them $23 billion in military equipment in the beginning of 2021. So it's just sort of like they're just stuffed with American equipment, and we can consider them such an important partner in the region. We facilitated their and Saudi Arabia's horrible, disastrous war in Yemen for so long, and it's just like this is how our friends repay us, friends and folks. It's almost insulting, just the way in which the U.S. is being used here. And one, no one seems to care, and two, like government, I don't even know what they just. I doubt we're not going to cut Egypt its check.
Right. I mean, and that should be just some additional context here, right? Is just remember, every time the U.S. claims to be on the side of democracy and freedom, just remember the U.S. One of its top recipients for decades has been Egypt, the military dictatorship, whose economy is heavily dependent on military spending. Like the military is the #1 employer. It's a military state. Certainly, the Christians in Egypt suffer horribly at the hands of the allies of the ruling regime there. I mean, it's just an awful regime. I wouldn't much like to live under the United Arab Emirates either. Certainly not exactly a friend to Western civilization, but yeah, another paid-off ally of the U.S. So let's get over this idea that the U.S. isn't the friends with democracy-loving regimes. Not to mention the Saudi regime, which at least until recently was firmly in the pocket of the U.S., although they're now working with Iran and China. Now on the military base thing with Russia. Now Russia, unlike the United States, doesn't have very many bases outside of. They're very near Iran, right? They have a small base really on the coast of Syria. And they've been in negotiations trying to do something with Vietnam, and that always just seems to get pushed farther into the future. So what was this plan with UAE? Was it going to be a place in the Persian Gulf where they would have a base? I wasn't quite sure on that.
I think it was just the UAE was going to repair Russian equipment. Like it wasn't going to be like a military base type thing, but it's just like they're facilitating someone we're literally like playing chicken with fighter jets right now in Syria. I mean, Syria is a whole mess. We should leave, of course. And then Russia and Syria and the UAE can do whatever they want. But the point is that we're being played for suckers here. As John Mearsheimer says, the U.S. is Uncle Sucker. So that's just annoying, insulting.
Well, isn't what really matters that these regimes continue to get money so they can buy American weapons? I mean, you hinted at that. Isn't that the real purpose of it all?
Yeah, lots of the military aid, it's not like we just give them a pallet of cash or something. It's basically vouchers to buy, tanks or whatever that employ people in important congressional districts in their manufacturing things like that. I mean, this is well known forever that the Pentagon places basically various military factories and all their various subcontractors and all that in important congressional districts so that they have leverage over Congress. Like, we can't cancel that program. You'll lose 500 jobs in your district. I mean, this is why the AC-10 Warthog, which which is a really cool plane. It has like a giant autocannon, but it's sort of been agreed now for years and years and years that would not be really feasible in a modern war to be shot down immediately. Like, people have said, we should give these to Ukraine, and it just sort of like, it would not last 5 seconds. It's like this kind of ground attack plane, but it's still there because, they just kept a lock on that congressional district. And I think the current representative of the district that they're based in was a pilot for them too. So it's just, that'll probably be around for a while too, even though of no use.
Well, on that issue of like spreading out military spending across congressional districts and stuff, there's actually, for those who are interested on how Congress schemes to keep spending going no matter what through that mechanism, there's a good book on this called The American Warfare State, The Domestic Politics of Military Spending by Rebecca U. Thorpe. This came out, I don't know, like 9-10 years ago. It looks like it's basically like an expansion on her PhD dissertation or something like that. But I would recommend it just to learn how that mechanism works if you're interested in like the domestic politics side of military spending, and just and how they keep it going, right? Why no one ever seems to oppose it, and no one ever want an actual cut in military spending. It's not just ideological. I mean, it's like built into the whole congressional spending system. So just if you're looking for a book to read, you want something deep in the political science files, there's a book for you. Now, one of the other big issues was the Pentagon's opinions and plans and assertion of what's going on in the Russo-Ukrainian war. So what's been their predictions there? It sounds like it's not nearly as triumphant internally at the Pentagon as we hear in the media about how glorious the Ukrainian victory will be.
If anyone has paid any attention to the news, they've probably heard of the looming Ukrainian counteroffensive. There's been talking about it for months and months and months, usually in the context of how we're sending them billions of dollars more weapons, so they'll be ready for this counteroffensive. And there's all this speculation about where it will be, when it will be. Like, one of the main goals is they want to sever the land bridge between Crimea and the rest of the area in the Donbass that Russia captured, and then, of course, Russia itself. And so this, again, is one of the documents I did not see, but the Washington Post has its hands on it, and it dates from early February, and it basically says, yeah, we don't think this counteroffensive is going to accomplish much. The Washington Post says that it's force generation and sustainment shortfalls, and that, quote, basically the best they can hope for is it will result in, quote, modest territorial gains. And so, yeah, as you said, of course, it's on its own. The Ukrainian military is being built up so much, and it's going to, with all this Western aid that we've just been pumping into the country, is going to launch this counteroffensive. And I've been, even before these leaks, I was like, what is this counteroffensive even ever going to happen? Like, one would happen, or if it does, quote, happen, it will just be like an online counteroffensive, or the counteroffensive has started. Nothing actually changes on the ground. And it's worth noting, the Ukrainian military did take back lots of territory last year. But part of the reason is because the Russian military, I have no idea what they're doing. They invaded Ukraine, and when, like, the general rule of thumb is you need a 3-to-1 ratio of attackers to defenders. Well, they had below a 1-to-1 ratio when they invaded Ukraine. And there's speculation that they basically thought they bribed enough people, like that's how, like, Kherson fell rapidly, is like the administration there apparently, like, was on the Russian side and stuff. And in other cases, they just paid people who just didn't follow through, and various other things. But still, it seemed very crazy. So these, sort of that northern sector around Kharkiv or Kharkov, there was barely anyone there, basically. In contrast, after that happened, Russia began, they instituted their call-up of reserves and all that, and they've been fortifying. I can't remember if it was Reuters or who was talking about how Russia's been fortifying all over, basically, the front lines. And also, the other thing is the whole front line is mined to heck by both sides. So I've read some people speculating Ukraine would have to do mine clearing before they could even launch their own counteroffensive. But anyway, so the U.S., the Pentagon is skeptical that there'll be some great success with this counteroffensive. And that big part of it is, generating enough trained people and enough equipment for the offensive to follow through. And this I have seen documents on. So let's see here. The one of the leaked documents. So here's sort of the thing. The guy, he's the Sam, or what was his first name? Texiera, whatever. Jack, right? He started by transcribing all these documents, and then he'd post them as text to this Discord server. And then he's like, well, this takes forever, and you guys aren't even reading it. And so then he just started taking pictures on his phone, which is how, I guess, the New York Times sort of got onto him, because they found his countertop that was in the background of some of the pictures. Anyway, so some of these documents are crinkled and hard to read, but anyway, there's this one document that breaks down the Western training of the brigades that are supposed to engage in the counteroffensive. There's supposed to be 12 brigades, 3 of which are going to be trained and equipped by Ukraine. The other 9 are going to be trained and equipped by the West. And it goes through each of the brigades, and for each one it has like a percentage of training complete and a percentage of equipment on hand. So this is from February 28th. This is when this leak document was compiled. And there are 3 whole brigades, that, no, 5 whole brigades are marked at 0% trained. So that's the end of February. And they're all supposed to be trained. It has that there's supposed to be 9 trained brigades by April 30th. So the best case scenario, they went from 0% to 100% trained in 2 months, which seems unlikely. But also, a lot of these brigades, none of them, as of February 28th, had 100% of their equipment on hand. And they're stuff from everything. American stuff, German, French, British, just all this, it's sort of, as I said before, scraping the bottom of the barrel to get this counteroffensive forged together. But here's what, to me, is really crazy, is the U.S. Pentagon doesn't think it's going to really accomplish much of anything. So if they don't think it's going to accomplish much of anything, and we're, throwing together everything we can, get our hands on for this, that's not going to accomplish it, what is the point? What is the purpose of this whole operation? I mean, it seems it's just going to get a bunch of people killed, and a bunch of, gajillions of dollars of equipment destroyed, and the war will basically continue on as before. So a part of me, I wonder if the counteroffensive will even happen. And there's some other logistical things we can get into as well regarding artillery shells and anti-air defense, but it's just, it might happen. I mean, and who knows? The future is radically uncertain. It could be a resounding success because of Russian incompetence or something. I don't think that's likely, though. So it seems there's no plan here other than throwing money and Ukrainians who have been chain ganged or shanghaied off the street into the meat grinder with no end goal in sight.
Well, and of course, it's very much already there's a online counteroffensive, if you want to count it that, because right, most days I go and I just look up Bakhmut, right, because that seems to be where the focus of the war is at the moment, is the war over the city and the ruins of Bakhmut, basically, at this point. And so if you just look at the headlines every day, it's always stuff about, oh, Ukraine says it's regained a few neighborhoods in Bakhmut, or Russia says it's advanced, it has almost surrounded Bakhmut. You'll occasionally see videos, and it's always just videos of Ukrainians killing Russians. You never see, of course, videos of the reverse, because I guess we're just supposed to believe Ukraine is just going from success to success in the region, and then they just throws out these numbers, like 100,000 Russians killed in Bakhmut alone. And I mean, I have no idea, right, just how far off that number is, because as even the Pentagon admits in these leaked documents, it's what they're ascertaining, how they ascertain the situation has nothing to do with what's reported in the media in terms of what's likely and what's going on in the region. And they are, if you look, they're already talking about a Ukrainian counteroffensive like happening. And I guess some piece of it is happening. The word is being used. Ukrainian counteroffensive regains parts of Bakhmut and all of that sort of stuff. But looking at the reality of it, there's so little change. Because I've been checking in on Bakhmut for months now, and nothing's going on except just more people being killed and more buildings being leveled and that sort of thing.
In this document, from like the end of February, U.S. military's analysis is like, oh, Bakhmut is like over, like the Ukrainians are done for. But here we are, still 2 months later. So yeah, I had thought that it would be over much sooner than now, and some people I've read have speculated that they're just Ukraine is continuing to feed people into basically to prevent, basically just to hold like everything there until it could also be non-material, more like a point of morale of like we can't lose Bakhmut, we've been fighting for it for so long. I don't know.
Well, it seems that from the American perspective, it's win-win in a certain way, in that you just keep spending money, keep using up arms that have to be replaced. And as long as you're not throwing a bunch of Americans into the meat grinder, most American voters aren't even going to notice or care or have much interest in it at all, but you can keep the money flowing in a big way. And then it all just works out for the American warfare state perspective. And I don't see why they would change their policy at all now. I mean, look at the U.S. support of Yemen, right? Nobody cared. And so just keep going. Now you can already see that Americans just don't even care about the war anymore. Yeah, on Twitter there's the people devoted to shouting down anyone who supports the war. There's polls, of course, online. There's plenty of Eastern Europeans online who have strong opinions about it, but they don't vote in the U.S. and ordinary people aren't paying any attention to those people. Yes, well,
although they do
another topic we can talk about another time is just how much influence some of these groups do have managed to have in U.S. think tanks, and to tell certain people to shut up for opposing the war. Too much, but of course you can't take any of these people seriously. I mean, Poland was one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, as was Ukraine, and sent plenty of soldiers to go kill Iraqis, but now suddenly have discovered their love of national sovereignty and territorial borders. But so forgetting about this part of the world, right? There's stuff in these leaked documents too about Asia and the Pacific. Is there not some stuff to do with the South Koreans?
Oh, South Korea, yes.
This the Five Eyes and all of that.
Quite interesting. So the U.S. has just giant caches of military equipment around the world. One place is in Israel, another place is South Korea. And the U.S. has been pulling our American-owned equipment out of these places in order to send to Ukraine. But South Korea is sort of like a military manufacturing powerhouse, as you might expect, given their sort of situation with North Korea. And so they have tons and tons, apparently, of of 155 millimeter artillery shells, which, let me pull up the latest fact sheet here, the U.S. has sent, over 1.5 million 155 millimeter artillery rounds to Ukraine. And we can talk about this later. Ukraine basically has no artillery shells. But so South Korea has this giant stockpile. And so we've been trying to pressure the South Korean government to send these shells to Ukraine, specifically 330,000. And the issue, it's my understanding that by law, South Korea cannot provide lethal military aid. And there's some sort of attempt to lift that law. But so how it works with the military sales, it's not like you just, I go down and buy a car, and then I can do whatever with the car. I can sell the car to my neighbor. With military equipment, there's end user inspections and all this stuff. And you might recall way back sometime last year, everyone was like freaking out in Germany because all these countries wanted to send some artillery to Ukraine. But there's German artillery, it's like East German artillery, really. And Germany was not granting them approval to do that, and then they did. So there's this, it's going back to how we apparently have spies everywhere. Like, the documents list basically everything, the entire breadth of the policy conversation in the South Korean administration. But this guy says this, and this person says this, and someone was like, we can't be on the phone with the president of the United States until we know what we're going to do for this. And so basically they were thinking maybe we can just send this stuff to Poland, and Poland can break the rules, and we'll just wink, wink, nod, nod, and Poland will send the artillery shells to Ukraine. And actually, one of the documents has this sheet of breakdowns of if South Korea agrees, here's how we can get the shells, by when the shells can get to Ukraine and stuff. And this, I've not seen anything else on this, and it was not like an announcement. It was like a leak of oh, this is going to happen. That South Korea was going to loan the United States 500,000 155 millimeter artillery rounds. Not exactly. I mean, I guess how that would work is that the U.S. would just then have these on hand, and we could then give another 500,000 rounds to Ukraine. Although, going back to our earlier episode, here it is. At current production rates, this is from that CSIS report, we cannot rebuild inventory because all of the production of artillery shells in the U.S. are used just for training. So it'll be years and years till we could repay that loan to South Korea if that were to actually happen. There was also other stuff about China launching a hypersonic missile and stuff like that. I mostly paid attention to Ukraine-related stuff. But yeah, we have intelligence penetration everywhere. I mean, people, it's just their job to write up these reports of what the spies have sent in, I guess, every day. All the office gossip in the various White Houses or their equivalents around the world.
Well, and of course, it's always a funny reminder. Americans act outraged when they really find out some other country is spying on the U.S. As if the United States respects the privacy and security of other states.
Right, and this was another leak that was pretty funny. It's not in the documents I've seen, but it's been reported on that Serbia has actually sent military equipment to Ukraine, which of course would be scandalous there, because the Serbian population in general is very pro-Russian, but the government is not. I mean, they're sort of surrounded by NATO and all that. So if true, that's just sort of hilarious, and also just screwed them over, because we probably had to twist some thumbs to get them to do that. And there's also outrage in South Korea over this. Are you spying on the president and all that sort of stuff?
Well, this has always been a point that Lou Rockwell makes, is that the government lies about everything, but they lie extra about foreign policy. You can rely even less on what they say when it comes to whatever they're telling you they're doing with other regimes, or whatever the position is. And this is true anywhere in the sense of especially the Serbian regime is just a perfect example of this, right? What they say 1 minute to appease the local population could be absolutely the opposite of what they say behind closed doors to leaders of other states. And it's just how, remember when we saw Lindsey Graham fist bumping with the current vice president over some dumb law that they had joined forces on and so on, right? Is that when they get together at their cocktail parties and diplomatic meetings, it's their club, and they're making promises to each other that may or may not have anything to do with what they're telling the public in public places. And so this is all just a reminder that you cannot believe anything that you get out of the regime in terms of what's going on in Ukraine, in terms of what the Pentagon thinks is feasible. I mean, who knows? You might get a good sense of it 10 years after the fact, after the historians do their work, or maybe when there's a leak and things like that. And so it's just always interesting to see these leaks. Now, I haven't seen quite the same level of hysteria over Jack Teixeira that I've seen over, say, Edward Snowden or Julian Assange, and they're traitors and need to be hanged, and they're endangering Americans and all of that sort of thing. I haven't seen a whole lot of claims here that these leaks endanger the lives of Americans. I wonder if that's just progress being made, or just that because the public just simply is totally uninterested now. I don't know. But it is interesting to see, I think, some changes over time in terms of how people react to these leaks. Not that that helps you any when you're on trial for violating these federal laws about leaking classified documents, but it's mostly the public doesn't even know who these people are after a few years, right? Like Reality Winner.
Right, and there wasn't, Edward Snowden had a dramatic escape to Russia, and Julian Assange was stuck in the embassy for, I don't even know how a long time. And he's still in prison and all this stuff. Whereas Jack, one, I think he's somewhat a sympathetic figure. I mean, in that he's like a kid, basically. I mean, I think it was the Washington Post or it was the New York Times interviewed some other people from this Discord server. And Jack, who was 21, was the oldest person on the server. Everyone else was basically teenagers. So he was leaking these classified documents to teenagers, basically, who were his friends. And one of the teenagers that was interviewed by one of the newspapers said, I'd go to jail. I wouldn't rat on him I'll talk to you, though, the reporters. But he's like, and then the reporter asked him why. And he's like, because he was my best friend. And that made me feel very sad. It sort of speaks to the alienation and loneliness of, well, everyone, but especially youth these days. It's like, I think some of the people met in person a few times, but it's like basically an online friend, and that's their only sort of companionship. It's quite sad. I mean, but also it sort of helps him, I think, in that he didn't do it for principled reasons. It doesn't help him at all when it comes to on trial and all that. But I guess in the public perception, if you do it, if